The rancher gave his last bread to an Apache woman, and the chief came back with an army of women. The sun was beginning to sink behind the jagged edges of the mountains, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and pink. On the edge of a dry, dusty desert, a lone ranch stood surrounded by miles of empty land. The wind carried a quiet stillness, and even the cattle seemed to sense the approach of evening. The rancher, a man known for his quiet strength and kind heart, moved slowly along the fence line, inspecting the cattle one last time before nightfall. His clothes were worn and dusty, his hands rough from years of labor, but his eyes carried a warmth that people who met him never forgot. The rancher had lived on this land for as long as he could remember. He had inherited it from his father, who had taught him the values of hard work, honesty, and most importantly, kindness. Though the land was harsh and unforgiving, he had always tried to make it a place of fairness and care, not just for himself, but for anyone who crossed his path in need. Still, life had become particularly difficult that year. A relentless drought had turned the pastures brown, the wells ran low, and the stores in the nearby town were expensive and scarce. Even the cattle were growing thin. Food was hard to come by, and the rancher knew that he could not last long without help. That evening he entered the small cabin that had been his home for decades. The cabin was simple, just a wooden table, a few chairs, and a small fireplace, but it had warmth in its simplicity. On the table lay a loaf of bread, his last one, carefully wrapped in a cloth. He held it in his hands, thinking about how he would make it last through the night. His stomach rumbled at the thought of going without, but he reminded himself that he had survived worse days before. He had always believed that there was enough to share, even when it seemed impossible. As he stared out the window, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains, he noticed movement near the edge of the property. At first he thought it was just the wind stirring the dust, but then he saw her. A woman, thin and weary, stumbled across the dry land. Her clothes were torn and dusty, and she moved slowly, each step seeming to take all her strength. Something about her presence stopped the rancher in his tracks. He had seen travelers before, but never someone in such dire need. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and stepped outside. "Are you all right?" he called gently, keeping a safe distance. His voice was calm, yet it carried concern. The woman looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. She was young, perhaps in her 20s, though the sun and hardship had already aged her beyond her years. Her eyes were filled with exhaustion, and yet there was a quiet dignity in the way she held herself, despite her condition. She nodded weakly but did not speak. The rancher moved closer, holding his hands in a non-threatening way. "You look hungry and tired," he said softly. "Come, I have water, sit for a moment." She hesitated but finally took a few steps toward him. Her steps were slow, almost hesitant, as if she feared that kindness might be a trap. But the rancher's face, lined with years of honesty and care, reassured her. She sat on the edge of the porch, lowering her head, and the rancher poured water into a cup from a small tin pitcher. She drank greedily, and he watched quietly, respecting her space. After she had finished drinking, the rancher returned to the cabin and brought out the loaf of bread. He held it in his hands, feeling its weight, aware that it was all he had left. He paused for a moment, thinking about the long days ahead and how he would manage with nothing to eat. And yet, when he looked back at the woman, sitting quietly and watching him with tired eyes, he knew what he had to do. He broke the loaf into pieces, giving her the larger portion. "Take it," he said simply. "You need it more than I do tonight." The woman looked at the bread, then back at him. Her lips trembled and tears welled in her eyes. She wanted to speak, to express her gratitude, but words seemed too small for the moment. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." The rancher smiled, a quiet, humble smile that came from deep within. "Don't mention it, just stay for a little while, rest. The night is coming fast and the desert can be cruel." As she ate, the rancher sat on the porch, watching the sky grow darker. The first stars began to appear, shimmering faintly against the deepening blue. The woman moved with surprising gentleness, despite her exhaustion, and slowly the tension in her shoulders eased. She looked up at the rancher, her eyes softening. "I did not expect anyone to help me," she said. "The world has not been kind lately." He nodded, understanding. "Sometimes kindness comes from the most unexpected places," he replied. "It does not always have to be earned. Some things are just given." The woman's story unfolded slowly, piece by piece. She was from a nearby Apache community, traveling alone through the desert to deliver a message to her family. The journey had been long and harsh, and she had run out of food days ago. The rancher listened quietly, never interrupting, never judging. He understood hardship. He had lived through droughts, failed crops, and loss. And in that understanding, a silent bond formed between them, a bond of shared humanity beyond language, culture, or circumstance. Night fell completely, and the air grew cooler. The rancher lit a small fire, the flames dancing and casting warm shadows on the cabin walls. They sat together in the quiet, listening to the distant howl of a coyote and the whisper of the wind through the dry grass. It was a simple moment, but it carried profound weight. Two strangers, brought together by chance, sharing what little they had, discovering that generosity could still exist in a harsh world. Before she left to continue her journey the next morning, the woman stood at the edge of the ranch, looking back at him. Her eyes glistened with gratitude and her voice was firm, carrying a promise. "Your kindness will not be forgotten," she said. The rancher waved, brushing away the worry that had been gnawing at him. "Go safely," he replied. "Take care of yourself." The desert is not easy on anyone. Little did the rancher know that this single act of giving, this simple choice to offer his last bread to someone in need, was about to create ripples far beyond the desert and the ranch. The woman returned to her community, carrying the story of his generosity with her. And in that community, stories like hers were listened to carefully, shared with elders, and remembered. The chief of the Apache tribe, a man of wisdom and honor, would soon hear of the rancher's act, and what followed would change the rancher's life in ways he could never have imagined. The rancher returned to his cabin that night with a quiet sense of peace. He had little, but he had done something right. The stars continued to shine above, indifferent yet beautiful, and the desert held its stillness. But beneath that stillness, a story had begun. One that would grow into something larger than any one person, something that would teach lessons of trust, compassion, and the power of a single act of humanity. As he prepared for sleep, he thought of the woman, of her courage and quiet strength. He realized that sometimes, helping someone was not just about the gift itself, but about acknowledging their humanity, their struggle, and their right to dignity. And for the first time in many months, the rancher felt a warmth that came not from food or shelter, but from the knowledge that he had made a difference. The night deepened, the wind whispered softly across the land, and somewhere not far away, the woman carried the memory of a simple loaf of bread, and the kindness of a man who had nothing yet gave everything he could. And so, in the quiet of the desert, the first chapter of their shared story ended, leaving the promise of what was yet to come, waiting just beyond the horizon. The morning sun rose slowly over the desert, casting a golden light on the ranch. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and earth. The rancher woke early, as he always did, to check on the cattle and begin his daily work. But even as he moved through his chores, his mind was not on the tasks at hand. It kept returning to the woman he had met the night before, the exhausted traveler who had appeared at the edge of his land, the woman who had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten, the power of kindness. He thought about her journey, about how she had crossed the harsh desert alone. He wondered if she had found her way safely to her people, if she had reached her family without further danger. The desert was unforgiving, and travelers often vanished without a trace, lost to its vastness. But he also felt a quiet hope, a feeling that perhaps, somehow, their brief encounter had made a difference in both their lives. News of the rancher's act began to travel faster than he could have imagined. By mid-morning, neighbors who had come to borrow tools or check on the cattle mentioned they had heard about the visitor. "I hear you gave your last bread to someone last night," one of them said, raising an eyebrow. "Is that true?" The rancher nodded, brushing his hands on his pants. "It's true. She needed it more than I did." Some neighbors shook their heads, muttering warnings. "You can't trust everyone," they said. "People out there will take advantage of you. Don't let yourself be fooled by strangers." Others, however, smiled and nodded with quiet admiration. "It's rare to see someone care so much," they said. "You've done something good." The rancher listened to their words, neither defensive nor boastful. He understood both sides. He knew the world could be cruel, but he also knew that one small act of generosity could make a world of difference. He went about his work, feeding the cattle, mending fences, and preparing water for the livestock. But a small part of him remained alert, wondering if he might see the woman again or if something might come of their meeting. Meanwhile, the woman had returned to her community, moving slowly but steadily through the desert. Her journey was still dangerous, and her body ached from hunger, thirst, and fatigue. Yet in her heart there was a new sense of hope. She had been received with kindness, not suspicion or anger, and the memory of the rancher's face, his quiet strength and gentle eyes, gave her courage to continue. When she finally reached her community, she was met with relief and concern. Her family and neighbors gathered around, asking questions and offering food and water. But she did not simply rest. She shared the story of her journey, of the long, empty desert, and of the man who had given her his last bread. Her voice was steady, though her hands still shook from exhaustion. "He had nothing to give," she said, "and yet he gave it all to me. He showed me that some people care without asking for anything in return." The women and elders of the community listened carefully. They were impressed, not only by the act of kindness but by the courage of the rancher. In their culture, acts of generosity and bravery were always remembered, passed down through stories and spoken of in gatherings. And so, the woman's story spread quickly. Children told their friends, adults spoke of it in quiet conversation, and soon, the chief himself heard of the man who had helped one of his people. The chief was a man of wisdom and authority, a leader respected by all in the tribe. He had spent his life guiding his people through challenges, teaching them the importance of honor, respect, and compassion. When he heard the story, he did not react with suspicion or anger, as some might have. Instead, he felt a deep respect for the rancher, a man who had given without expectation, who had risked his last possession to help someone in need. The chief called a council, gathering the women and elders to discuss the matter. "We must remember the generosity shown to one of our own," he said. "A man who has nothing and still gives is a man of great heart. We cannot forget this. We will show our respect in a way that honors both his kindness and the dignity of our people." The elders nodded in agreement, and the women of the community began to prepare, quietly discussing how they might express their gratitude. Back at the ranch, life continued in its usual rhythm, though the air seemed lighter now, carrying the invisible presence of the woman and the story she had shared. The rancher continued his work, tending to the cattle, repairing fences, and walking the dusty paths of his land. Yet he noticed small changes, neighbors looking at him with new respect, townspeople speaking in hushed admiration. Even strangers who passed through seemed to recognize something different about him, though none knew exactly what had happened. Days passed, and the rancher began to forget some of the worry he had felt about scarcity. He focused on the rhythm of his work and the simple tasks that kept his land alive. And yet, he could not shake the sense that something more was coming, that the story of his act of kindness had set events into motion that he could not yet see. The woman's community did not forget either. She became a messenger of the rancher's character, speaking of him not as a stranger but as someone worthy of trust and respect. The chief, moved by the story, began to plan a visit. He wanted to meet this man who had shown such courage and generosity, a man who had proven that even in times of scarcity, human kindness could thrive. In the days that followed, preparations were quietly made. The chief consulted with the women of the community, asking for their support in this gesture of gratitude. They gathered supplies, food, and provisions, ensuring that when they approached the ranch, they would come with respect and not confrontation. Their plan was simple. They would travel to the ranch as a sign of appreciation, not to demand anything or create conflict. It was an opportunity to honor someone who had honored them through his selfless act. Meanwhile, the rancher went about his day unaware of what was coming. He mended fences, fed the animals, and repaired the small cabin that had sheltered him for so many years. Yet he felt a quiet anticipation in the air, though he could not explain why. Something about the desert seemed different, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for events to unfold. At night, he would sit on the porch, looking out at the stars and thinking of the woman who had passed through his life so briefly but left such a lasting impact. He wondered if she had reached her family safely, if she was eating well, if she had found comfort after such a difficult journey. In those quiet moments, he realized that even small gestures could ripple outward in ways one could never predict. A single loaf of bread, given without expectation, had set in motion a chain of events that would bring two very different worlds together. As the days passed, the story of the rancher and the woman grew. Word traveled through the desert, across towns and hills, carried by travelers and neighbors. People spoke of a man who gave his last bread to someone in need, of courage in the face of scarcity, of generosity that knew no bounds. It became a story not just of survival, but of the human spirit, of the quiet, powerful ways in which kindness could change lives. The rancher continued his work, unaware that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The chief, who had heard the story directly from the woman, began organizing a visit, gathering a group of women from his community to accompany him. They would come not as strangers, not as invaders, but as a living testament to the power of gratitude and respect. Their journey across the desert would be long and challenging, but their purpose was clear: to honor the man who had shown that even in the hardest times, generosity could shine brighter than fear or doubt. And so life moved forward, each day bringing the rancher closer to an encounter that would test his courage, his humility, and his capacity for trust. The desert held its quiet, golden light, the winds whispered through the dry grasses, and the world seemed to wait patiently for what was to come. The woman's story, now firmly rooted in her community, continued to inspire. Children spoke of it as if it were a tale from the past, yet it was very real, a testament to human kindness and the connections that could form between strangers. The chief himself spoke of it in quiet moments, reminding his people that respect and generosity were not weaknesses but strengths, that one act of courage could build bridges where none seemed possible. For the rancher, the days continued with their familiar rhythm, each moment filled with labor, thought, and quiet reflection. He could not know that soon, the horizon would bring figures approaching his land, figures who carried not weapons, but the gratitude of a community, a living reminder of the impact of his simple, selfless act. And in that future encounter, he would discover that kindness given in one moment could blossom into something far greater than he had ever imagined. And so, the story waited, poised on the edge of the desert, ready to unfold in a way that would forever change the lives of all involved. The seeds of gratitude had been planted, and the winds of the desert whispered that soon, something extraordinary would emerge. Days passed at the ranch with their usual rhythm, cattle to feed, fences to mend, and the wind carrying the quiet stillness of the desert. Yet, beneath the calm surface, something was stirring. The rancher noticed subtle changes. The desert seemed more alive, the wind carried a certain tension, and even the animals seemed slightly alert, sensing something unusual in the air. He could not put his finger on it, but an unspoken feeling told him that his life was about to change in ways he had never imagined. One morning, as he walked along the edge of his property, checking the fences and looking after his cattle, he spotted movement on the horizon. At first, he assumed it was a small group of travelers or perhaps a family passing by. But as he watched more closely, he realized it was something far larger. A group of people was moving steadily across the desert, their figures silhouetted against the rising sun. The rancher's heart beat faster, a mixture of curiosity, caution, and unease filling him. He had lived in this area for many years and had seen all sorts of people pass through, some friendly, some hostile. He knew better than to assume intentions based on appearances. Still, there was something different about this group. They moved with purpose, not aimlessly like wanderers. Their pace was steady, and their formation suggested coordination and intention. The rancher's instincts, honed by years of living in isolation and facing the harsh desert, told him to prepare for anything. He returned to his cabin and quickly secured the livestock. He closed the gates, checked the fences, and ensured that everything that could be protected was safe. He kept a watchful eye on the approaching group, moving quietly along the porch and peering through the dusty windows. As they drew closer, he could see more clearly that the group was composed entirely of women. At first, he was puzzled. Why would a large group of women be traveling together, so far from their community, through a desert where dangers lurked at every turn? The rancher's thoughts raced. Could this be a misunderstanding, a threat, or something else entirely? He had learned long ago that the desert was unpredictable and that people often appeared when least expected. He grabbed a walking stick for support and moved toward the edge of the property, trying to get a better view. The women were approaching steadily, their expressions calm yet purposeful. They carried bundles, not weapons, and there was a quiet dignity in the way they moved. As they reached the outskirts of the rancher could see one figure at the front who seemed to be leading the group. She was older, with a strong posture and calm eyes that carried wisdom. He instinctively recognized her as a leader, someone whose presence commanded respect. Soon, he realized that she must be the chief's representative or someone close to the chief himself. The weight of the situation became clear. These women were not merely travelers. They were here with intent, and their intent seemed tied to the story he had never expected to reach anyone beyond the desert. The rancher took a deep breath and stepped forward cautiously. "Who are you?" he called, his voice steady but cautious. The leader of the group stopped and lifted her hand slightly, a gesture of peace. "We are friends," she said softly, yet firmly, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "We come to honor you." The rancher's eyes widened in surprise. He had expected confrontation, perhaps demands, maybe even threats, but not this. "Honor me?" he asked, uncertain how to respond. The leader nodded. "Yes, you have shown kindness to one of our people, and we have come to show our respect." "We mean no harm." The rancher's mind raced. Memories of the woman he had helped flooded back, the exhausted traveler, her grateful eyes, the way she had carried his simple act of generosity with her. Could it be that this group was here because of her? He felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. I don't understand," he said slowly. "Why would you come all this way for me?" The leader smiled, a quiet and knowing smile. "Your act of kindness reached our chief," she explained. "He has asked us to come to show our gratitude and to offer help in return. You risked your last bread to feed someone in need, and that has not been forgotten. We come now to honor that." The rancher felt a swell of emotion, a mixture of humility, surprise, and gratitude. He had acted out of instinct, without expectation of reward or recognition, and now the consequences of that simple choice were unfolding in a way he could never have imagined. He lowered his gaze, unsure how to express his feelings. I didn't do it for recognition," he said softly. I just wanted to help." The women began to approach the ranch, moving with care so as not to disturb the animals or damage the land. They carried bundles of food, water, and supplies, simple gifts meant to show respect and appreciation. The rancher watched as they set down the provisions, realizing that this gesture was not just about material aid. It was about connection, respect, and the acknowledgement of shared humanity. The leader of the group stepped closer, her eyes meeting the ranchers. "We come in peace," she said. "Our chief believes that generosity and honor must be recognized. You have shown both, and we honor that today." The rancher nodded, feeling a deep sense of awe and humility. He had never expected anything like this, and yet here it was, a living testament to the power of kindness, traveling across the desert and bridging cultures in ways that seemed almost magical. As the sun climbed higher, casting its bright light across the desert, the women began to help with tasks around the ranch. They tended to the animals, repaired fences, and prepared simple meals. The rancher watched in quiet wonder, realizing that this was more than assistance. It was a sharing of knowledge, tradition, and care. Each woman carried skills that had been passed down through generations, and their presence brought a sense of calm and efficiency that complemented the rancher's own work. The day passed in a mixture of labor and conversation. The women spoke of their lives, their traditions, and the values that guided their community. They asked about the rancher's life, his work, and the challenges he faced. In return, he shared stories of the desert, the cattle, and the simple routines that kept his ranch alive. Though they came from very different worlds, there was a growing bond, a mutual respect born from shared effort and understanding. The rancher could not help but reflect on how quickly life could change. Only a few days ago, he had been alone, facing scarcity and hardship, unsure how he would survive the coming weeks. Now, his world had expanded in ways he could never have predicted. A single act of giving, his last bread to a stranger, had set in motion events that brought support, friendship, and respect from people he had never imagined meeting. By evening, the group had settled comfortably around a small fire, the flames flickering and casting dancing shadows on the ground. The rancher joined them, sitting quietly and listening as they spoke of the chief, their community, and the ways in which kindness was valued above all else. The conversation was gentle, yet profound, touching on themes of honor, gratitude, and the strength found in helping others without expectation. As the stars appeared overhead, the rancher realized that this was a moment he would never forget. The desert, often harsh and unforgiving, had revealed a hidden truth, that human connection, respect, and generosity could create bonds stronger than fear, prejudice, or distance. The women's presence was a living reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond what one could see. Before resting for the night, the leader of the group spoke quietly to the rancher. "Our chief wanted you to know that your actions matter," she said. "You have reminded us that there is goodness in the world even in difficult times. We will carry this story back to him, and he will honor you in his way." The rancher nodded, feeling a quiet humility. He had acted without expectation, yet the impact of his choice was clear and profound. As the night deepened, the desert settled into its quiet rhythm. The wind whispered through the dry grass, the cattle slept peacefully in the fenced pastures, and the rancher sat by the fire, reflecting on the extraordinary events of the day. He realized that life was full of unexpected moments, that small choices could lead to incredible outcomes, and that generosity, true generosity, had the power to change the world, one act at a time. And so the rancher's life had shifted, not through wealth or power, but through compassion. The arrival of the chief's women marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with cooperation, understanding, and mutual respect. The desert, which had once seemed so lonely and harsh, now felt alive with possibility. The rancher knew that the days ahead would bring new challenges, but he also knew that he would face them with the support of people who valued honor, kindness, and the bonds of humanity. The stars shone brightly above, as if acknowledging the moment, and the rancher understood that this was just the beginning. The desert held its secrets, but it also held lessons about courage, compassion, and the remarkable ways in which lives could intersect. The women's presence was a living reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, hope and humanity could thrive, and that a single act of kindness could echo across time and distance, bringing unexpected blessings in return. The sun rose over the desert once more, casting golden light on the ranch and illuminating the quiet activity that had begun. The arrival of the Apache women had brought not only surprise and curiosity, but also a sense of energy and purpose to the ranch. For the first time in many months, the rancher felt a spark of hope. The land, which had seemed so harsh and unforgiving, now appeared alive with possibility. The women moved with confidence and skill, tending to the animals and the ranch buildings. Some carried water from the nearby well, while others repaired broken fences with surprising efficiency. Their presence was organized yet gentle, showing care not only for the ranch but for the animals and the land itself. The rancher watched from a distance at first, hesitant to intrude, but he soon realized that their help was not just physical. It carried wisdom, experience, and a sense of respect for the natural world. He joined them in their work, learning from their methods and offering guidance from his own years of experience. Though they came from different cultures, a silent understanding developed between them. Tasks were completed efficiently, but always with care. The women showed him ways to conserve water, preserve food, and maintain the cattle through the ongoing drought. In return, he taught them the practical skills of the ranch, the rhythms of feeding and caring for the livestock, and the importance of observation and patience in such a harsh environment. As they worked side by side, stories began to flow. The women spoke of their families, their community, and the traditions that had guided them for generations. They told of the ways they gathered food, tended gardens, and cared for the sick and elderly. The rancher shared his own experiences, describing the years he had spent on the land, the challenges he had faced, and the quiet moments of satisfaction that came from hard work done well. Though words were different in some cases, understanding was universal. Actions, expressions, and gestures conveyed respect and learning, and soon, laughter began to echo across the dusty land. The days turned into weeks, and the ranch became a place of cooperation and learning. The rancher, who had once been alone in the vast desert, now found companionship and friendship in those who had come from afar. The women taught him how to preserve fruits and herbs even in the hottest months, how to craft simple tools from natural materials, and how to observe the land for signs of changes in weather or the movement of animals. In return, he guided them in tending the cattle, repairing structures, and understanding the delicate balance between the ranch and the surrounding desert. In the evenings, they would gather around a fire, sharing food and stories. The firelight illuminated their faces, highlighting the lines of experience, laughter, and wisdom. Conversations ranged from practical matters to reflections on life and humanity. The rancher learned about the chief's leadership, the traditions of the Apache people, and the ways in which generosity and honor were woven into their daily lives. The women learned about his solitude, his values, and the deep connection he felt to the land he had inherited. One evening, as the fire flickered and stars began to appear in the clear desert sky, one of the women spoke softly, her voice carrying a gentle authority. "Your act of kindness has changed more than one life," she said. "It has reminded us that people from different worlds can meet with respect, and that trust can grow even where there was once fear." The rancher looked into the fire, thinking about how strange and wonderful life could be. He had given something small, something ordinary in his eyes, and yet it had led to extraordinary outcomes. The rancher and the women began to work on long-term improvements to the ranch. They dug a deeper water well, reinforced fences, and created small storage areas for food and supplies. Each project was completed with care, often involving laughter and conversation. Even the cattle seemed to sense the harmony, moving calmly and eating peacefully as if they understood the new energy that had settled over the land. One day, a particularly strong wind swept through the desert, kicking up dust and dry leaves. The women quickly moved to secure the supplies and check the animals. The rancher marveled at their efficiency and teamwork. "You handle this as if you've done it 100 times," he said. One of the women smiled. "We have learned from our elders," she replied. "We know how to survive and care for what we hold dear." He realized that he too had learned lessons not only in survival but in humility, patience, and the value of shared effort. The days passed in this rhythm of work and cooperation. Yet the rancher began to notice something deeper than efficiency and skill. The women were teaching him about empathy, about the quiet strength that comes from caring for others without expecting anything in return. They showed him that true leadership was not about authority or power, but about guiding, protecting, and nurturing. Each small lesson built a bridge between their worlds, creating trust and understanding that grew stronger with every shared task. One afternoon, as the sun burned high in the sky, the rancher and a few of the women were repairing a section of the fence that had been damaged in a recent windstorm. They worked side by side in silence for a while, listening to the wind and the occasional call of a distant bird. Then one of the women paused, looking at the rancher with calm eyes. "You are different from many we have met," she said softly. "You act from the heart, not for recognition or reward. That is rare." The rancher paused, considering her words. "I do what I can," he replied simply. "It is all I know how to do." The woman nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "It is enough," she said, "more than enough." And it teaches others that kindness is stronger than fear, stronger than scarcity, stronger than doubt. The rancher felt a quiet warmth at her words. He realized that life was about these moments, moments of connection, understanding, and shared effort. As the days turned into weeks, the rancher began to notice changes within himself. The solitude he had once valued now felt incomplete without companionship. He cherished the quiet laughter, the shared work, and the conversations by the fire. He discovered that human connection brought a strength that labor alone could not provide. He also realized that his world, once small and limited to the ranch and its boundaries, had expanded in ways he could never have imagined. The women's community, too, was involved indirectly in the rancher's life. The chief, who had sent them, continued to watch over them, ensuring their safety and honoring their mission of respect and gratitude. The rancher had not yet met the chief, but he felt the chief's presence through the women, the values they carried, the care they showed, and the stories they shared. Every action reflected the wisdom of a leader who understood that generosity could unite people across differences. One evening, as the fire crackled and the desert sky filled with stars, the rancher reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the moment he had given his last bread to the exhausted traveler, his life had transformed. He had expected nothing, and yet he had received so much: friendship, knowledge, companionship, and a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that small acts could create extraordinary outcomes, and that human kindness, when genuine, could ripple far beyond what one could imagine. The women, too, felt the bond growing stronger. They had come to honor him, but in doing so, they had formed connections that were reciprocal, built on respect, care, and shared work. They had brought their skills and traditions, but they had also learned from the rancher's experience, discovering new ways to approach challenges and care for the land and animals. Together, they had created a micro-community, a space where understanding and empathy flourished. The rancher began to plan for the future with their help. He thought about ways to make the ranch more resilient to drought, how to store food and water efficiently, and how to care for the cattle throughout the harsh seasons. Each plan involved collaboration, learning from one another, and respecting the knowledge and traditions each person brought. In doing so, he realized that leadership was not about doing everything alone, but about building trust, listening and valuing others' contributions. Days flowed into months, and the ranch thrived. The once struggling land began to show signs of life, the cattle grew healthier, and the rancher's spirit was renewed. The women's presence had created not only practical improvements, but also a sense of community and belonging. The desert, which had once seemed harsh and lonely, now felt alive with possibility, filled with stories, laughter, and shared effort. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, the rancher stood at the edge of his land, looking out over the pastures and the desert beyond. He saw the women moving efficiently among the cattle, tending to the land with care and purpose. He felt a deep gratitude, not just for their help, but for the lessons they had taught him about empathy, patience, and the strength of human connection. He knew that their visit was more than a simple gesture of thanks. It had transformed his life in ways he could never have anticipated. And so, the rancher understood that kindness, respect, and shared work could overcome fear, scarcity, and isolation. The arrival of the chief's women had created a new chapter in his life, one filled with learning, understanding, and mutual respect. The desert, once silent and lonely, was now a place of connection, growth, and hope. The future remained uncertain, as it always does, but the rancher no longer faced it alone. He had learned that generosity could build bridges, that respect could create bonds stronger than distance or difference, and that even the smallest act of kindness could lead to profound and lasting change. And so, as the sun set over the desert once more, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the rancher and the women prepared for another night by the fire, sharing stories, warmth, and the quiet understanding that their lives were now intertwined in ways that would endure. Far beyond the challenges of the desert. The desert morning was calm, almost serene, as the rancher stepped outside his cabin and looked over the land he had cared for all his life. The cattle grazed quietly in the pastures, and the fences, repaired with the help of the Apache women, stood strong against the wind. The rancher had grown accustomed to their presence, yet he still marveled at the changes that had come to his life and to the ranch itself. What had begun as a simple act of kindness, giving his last bread to a weary traveler, had grown into something far greater than he could have imagined. Over the weeks, the women had become an integral part of life on the ranch. Their energy, skill, and knowledge had transformed the way the rancher approached his work. They taught him how to conserve water, care for the animals during drought, and preserve food for long periods. Their hands were gentle but strong, and their wisdom seemed to touch every corner of the ranch, from the pastures to the cabins. The rancher had learned to trust them completely, recognizing that their guidance came from generations of experience and a deep understanding of the land. As the day went on, the rancher noticed a ripple of excitement moving through the women. They spoke quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing toward the horizon. Curiosity piqued, he approached one of them. "Is something happening?" he asked. She smiled, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Our chief is coming," she said softly. "He has heard of your kindness directly from the woman you helped. He wishes to meet you and honor what you have done." The rancher's heart raced. He had not expected this. Meeting the chief of a community he had only touched indirectly through a single act of generosity was overwhelming. He felt a mixture of humility, nervousness, and a quiet pride. He had acted without expectation, yet now the consequences of his kindness were unfolding in a way that brought both honor and responsibility. As the sun climbed higher, a distant dust cloud appeared on the horizon. The rancher squinted, trying to see through the haze. Slowly, the figures of people became clearer. A small group approached first, moving steadily across the desert. They carried no weapons, only bundles and simple tools, but their presence commanded respect. At the front was a tall man, strong and composed, with eyes that seemed to hold both wisdom and authority. This was the chief, and the rancher felt a shiver of anticipation run down his spine. The chief stopped at the edge of the ranch, his gaze meeting the rancher's. There was a brief silence, heavy with meaning, as two men from very different worlds studied each other. Then the chief stepped forward, extending a hand in greeting. "I am honored to meet you," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I have heard of your kindness and I have come to show our respect." The rancher shook his hand, feeling the strength and sincerity in the chief's grip. "It is my honor," he replied quietly. "I only did what anyone should do." The chief smiled, but his eyes reflected a deep understanding. "Kindness given without expectation is rare," he said. "It is the measure of a person's heart. Your actions have not been forgotten, and they have inspired us. That is why I have come, to show that respect and gratitude can travel across the desert and reach even the most distant lands." The women who had traveled with the chief began to move among the ranch, assisting with preparations for the gathering. They carried baskets of food, blankets, and other supplies, ensuring that both the chief and the rancher were comfortable. Their presence was quiet but commanding, reflecting the care and organization that had been a part of their journey from the very beginning. The rancher watched in awe as they worked, realizing how far his simple gesture had traveled, touching not only one person but an entire community. As the day progressed, the rancher and the chief spoke at length. They shared stories of the land, of survival, and of the values that guided their lives. The rancher learned about the chief's leadership, the importance of honor and respect in his community, and the ways in which generosity was woven into daily life. The chief, in turn, listened to the rancher's experiences, hearing about the challenges of the desert, the care required for the cattle, and the solitude that had shaped him into the man he had become. Through their conversation, a mutual understanding developed, a recognition that despite differences in culture and background, certain values were universal. Kindness, respect, and a commitment to helping others transcended distance, language, and tradition. The rancher realized that his actions, though small and seemingly ordinary, had bridged a gap between two worlds, creating trust and friendship where none had existed before. The chief and the rancher then joined the women in the tasks of the ranch. Together, they worked to repair structures, organize supplies, and tend to the animals. The chief's presence added a sense of formality, but he worked alongside them quietly, demonstrating that leadership was not about commanding, but about participating, guiding, and supporting. The rancher felt a deep sense of respect for the chief and for the community he represented. By evening, a fire was lit in the center of the ranch, and the group gathered around it to share food, stories, and music. The chief spoke of the woman who had first crossed the desert, recounting her bravery and determination. He spoke of the importance of gratitude and respect, emphasizing that acts of kindness, no matter how small, could create ripples that touched many lives. The rancher listened, humbled and moved, realizing that his simple choice to give had become part of something much larger, a story of connection, trust, and shared humanity. As the night deepened, the rancher reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of the exhausted traveler, of the women who had arrived from the chief's community, and of the chief himself. Each encounter had taught him something profound about the nature of kindness, the strength of empathy, and the power of human connection. He realized that life's most meaningful moments often came unexpectedly, through small gestures that carried immense weight. The chief spoke quietly to the rancher as the fire crackled. "You have reminded us that the world is not only about survival, but about the care we show to one another," he said. "Your generosity has inspired courage, trust, and hope. That is a gift greater than any material reward." The rancher nodded, feeling the truth of the chief's words. He had acted without expectation, yet the impact of his choice was undeniable. The women, too, reflected on the journey and the bonds they had formed. They had come to honor the rancher, but in doing so, they had discovered friendship, shared knowledge, and a deep appreciation for the life and work he had built in the desert. Their presence had not only helped the rancher, but had also enriched their own understanding of the world beyond their community. In the following days, the ranch became a hub of cooperation and learning. The chief remained for a time, working alongside the rancher and the women, sharing wisdom and guidance. Together, they developed plans for sustainable water use, improved storage for food and supplies, and better care for the cattle. The rancher learned new techniques and strategies, while also sharing his own knowledge of the land and livestock. Each day brought new lessons, laughter, and moments of quiet reflection. The bond between the rancher and the chief grew stronger, built on mutual respect and shared experience. They walked the pastures together, discussing the challenges of the land and the possibilities for its future. They spoke of family, community, and the values that guided their actions. The rancher realized that leadership and strength were not measured by power alone, but by the ability to care for others, to inspire trust, and to act with integrity. As the weeks passed, the rancher noticed the profound changes in his own life. The once lonely ranch was now filled with energy, cooperation, and friendship. The women had become part of daily life, their skills and presence enriching every task. The land itself seemed more alive, the cattle healthier and the atmosphere lighter, filled with laughter and conversation. The desert, once harsh and solitary, had become a place of connection and hope. One evening, as the fire burned low and the stars shone brightly overhead, the rancher and the chief stood together, looking over the land. The rancher felt a deep sense of gratitude for the women, for the chief, and for the journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness. He realized that generosity could ripple outward in ways beyond comprehension, that trust and respect could bridge even the widest gaps, and that one person's choice could change lives far beyond their immediate reach. The chief placed a hand on the rancher's shoulder. "Your kindness has created a legacy," he said softly. "Not only for your land and your animals, but for the connections you have made, the trust you have built, and the lives you have touched. That is a gift that will endure long after this moment." The rancher nodded, humbled and moved, understanding the weight and truth of the chief's words. As the desert night embraced the rancher felt a quiet peace. The fire crackled softly, the cattle rested peacefully, and the women slept nearby, safe and secure. The land had been transformed not just by physical work, but by the bonds of trust, respect, and shared humanity. The story of the rancher's last bread had grown into a story of connection, gratitude, and hope, a story that would be told for generations, inspiring others to act with kindness and courage. And so, the rancher's life had changed forever. He had learned that one small act of generosity could spark a chain of events more powerful than he had ever imagined. The chief, the women, and the community had reminded him that kindness was a language everyone could understand, that respect could cross cultural boundaries, and that human connection was the greatest gift of all. As dawn broke over the desert, the rancher stood at the edge of his land, looking out at the pastures, the mountains, and the horizon beyond. He understood that the journey was far from over. Challenges would come, as they always did, but he no longer faced them alone. With the wisdom, support, and friendship of those who had entered his life, he felt ready to meet the future with courage, compassion, and hope. The story that began with a single loaf of bread had blossomed into a legacy of respect, generosity, and trust. It was a reminder that even the smallest gestures, when given from the heart, could change lives, build communities, and create bonds that endure. And in the quiet desert under the endless sky, the rancher, the chief, and the women had created a story that would echo across generations, a story of humanity at its finest, of lives intertwined by kindness, and of hope that could never be extinguished.